From the sun-scorched lip of the canyon, where eagles dared not nest, the eyes of Hasteen Yazzie, a name that could silence a raucous saloon or make a seasoned tracker turn pale, watched the dust cloud resolve into a battered stagecoach. He wasn't watching the coach itself, but the woman who descended from it, a ghost in a gray bonnet, stepping into the brutal heart of Whisperwind Gulch. He saw not just a weary traveler, seeking the mirage of anonymity. He saw the invisible chains of a horrific past still clinging to her, the faint, silvery scar at her temple a testament to unspeakable cruelties. And he recognized the scent of the wolves who had forged those chains, wolves whose specific brand of evil was a deep, festering wound upon his own soul. Her desperate hope for peace, he knew with a chilling, absolute certainty, was about to ignite a firestorm of vengeance, a storm he himself had long prayed for the winds to deliver. Her arrival was not an end to her flight, but the unwitting beginning of a long-delayed reckoning. Abigail, for that was the name she now carried, a name as plain and unremarkable as the worn dress she wore, moved with a quiet desperation to dissolve into the rough tapestry of the frontier town. She sought work with Martha, the proprietor of the town's only general store, a woman whose gaze was sharp but whose heart, Abigail sensed, possessed a rare vein of kindness. Martha offered her the mending of clothes, the stitching of torn canvas, tasks Abigail accepted with a gratitude so profound it was almost painful, yet she kept it carefully veiled behind downcast eyes and few words. Her days became a study in deliberate unobtrusiveness. She learned the rhythms of Whisperwind Gulch, the creak of the saloon doors swinging open to disgorge boisterous miners, the distant ring of the blacksmith's hammer, the low murmur of commerce. But her quietness was not born of a timid nature. It was a shield, a finely honed tool of survival. Her gaze, though rarely meeting another's directly, missed little. She noted the way young Timmy Henderson, the stable boy, always favored his left leg after being kicked by a mule. She saw the almost imperceptible tremor in the hand of Mr. Abernathy, the bank clerk, whenever he counted out large sums of money, a detail that spoke of some hidden anxiety. She observed Sheriff Brody's habit of scanning the rooftops whenever strangers rode in, a veteran's instinct for unseen threats. These observations were not idle. They were calculations, assessments, ingrained reflexes from a life where noticing the smallest anomaly could mean the difference between temporary safety and sudden, brutal recapture. A sudden shout, a door slamming unexpectedly, would cause an almost invisible tightening of her jaw, a momentary stillness in her hands, before she forced herself to resume her task. It was the hypervigilance of a doe that has known the wolf's breath on its flank, forever listening for the snap of a twig. She craved only to be a shadow, a whisper, to let the dust of this forgotten town settle over her past and bury it completely. But the fragile piece of Whisperwind Gulch, a piece as thin and brittle as old glass, was destined to shatter. It began with the arrival of 3 riders, men who looked as if they'd been spat out from the rawest, most lawless corners of the territory. Their leader, a greasy, leering man named Cully, had eyes like a carrion crow, constantly scanning, assessing, hungry. They rode with an arrogant disdain for the town and its inhabitants, their presence an immediate, visceral blight. Abigail was in the dim interior of Martha's store, sorting through a new delivery of thread, when she heard their horses clatter to a halt outside. A glance through the grimy window, a glimpse of Cully's profile as he dismounted, was enough. A cold dread, sharp and sickening, pierced through her. The spool of thread slipped from her fingers, rolling unnoticed into the dust beneath a counter. Her breath caught, her heart beginning a frantic, suffocating rhythm against her ribs. She recoiled from the window as if struck, pressing herself into the shadows at the back of the store. Cully's gaze swept the street, and for a terrifying instant, she felt it pause on the storefront, a wolf testing the wind. Later, the whispers reached her, carried on the anxious currents of town gossip. Cully and his men were asking questions in the Rusty Spur saloon, their inquiries casual at first, then more pointed. They spoke of a woman traveling alone, seeking a quiet place. Their descriptions, though vague, were like cold fingers tracing the outline of Abigail's carefully constructed anonymity. Sheriff Brody, his face etched with the weariness of a man perpetually outnumbered and outgunned, offered them curt, uninformative answers. His dislike for the newcomers palpable, but his power to eject them limited. High above, unseen on the canyon rim, where he often came to trade, or simply observe the comings and goings of the white man's world, Hasteen Yazzie watched. He had noted the arrival of Cully's trio, marked the distinctive, tooled leather of their saddlebags, the nervous energy of their horses, which spoke of hard riding. He saw the way they carried themselves, not as drifters, but as men on a specific, predatory mission. He also saw Abigail later that evening, scurrying from the store to her small rented cabin, her figure shrinking into the twilight, her movements imbued with a fresh, desperate urgency. A familiar coldness settled in his gut. The patterns were aligning, the scent of old, bitter conflicts rising on the wind. He knew, with a grim certainty that needed no words, that these men were not mere troublemakers. They were harbingers. The days that followed were a slow, agonizing descent into escalating fear for Abigail. Cully and his companions showed no sign of departing Whisperwind Gulch. They were a constant, looming presence, their lewd comments and belligerent behavior poisoning the air. Their questions about a woman, now described with unsettling accuracy, her approximate age, the color of her hair glimpsed beneath her bonnet, the scar she tried so desperately to conceal, became more direct, more openly threatening. Abigail felt the net tightening. Sleep offered no respite, only a churning landscape of old terrors and new anxieties. She took to working even later at Martha's, using the quiet solitude of the night as a temporary shield, mending by the flickering, insufficient light of a single lamp. Martha, her intuition keen, offered silent comfort, an extra blanket on a cold night, a share of her meager stew, a protective word when one of Cully's men loitered too long near the store entrance. She asked no direct questions, for which Abigail was profoundly grateful, but her eyes held a deep, compassionate understanding. Sheriff Brody confronted Cully's men again, his voice tight with warning, demanding they cease their harassment. They responded with open mockery, Cully drawling that they were just exercising their right to ask questions, a thin veneer of legality over their predatory intent. His eyes, however, never left the general store for long. The inevitable confrontation happened on a blistering afternoon. Abigail, needing a specific type of needle from a spare supplies box kept in the small shed behind the livery, found her path blocked. Cully materialized from the shadows of the stable overhang, his bulk filling the narrow passage. His grin was a slash of stained teeth in his unshaven face. He told her she looked familiar, like someone they were looking for, someone who owed a serious debt. His voice was a low, suggestive growl, heavy with menace. Abigail's blood ran cold. For a moment, she was paralyzed, the years of flight culminating in this suffocating, terrifying instant. Then, a primal survival instinct kicked in. She feigned to stumble, dropping the small tin of needles, and in that brief moment of distraction, she squeezed past him, scraping her arm raw against the splintered wood of the stable wall. She ran, blindly, desperately, not stopping until she burst through the back door of the general store, gasping for breath, her carefully constructed composure shattered into 1,000 trembling pieces. From his vantage point, Hasteen Yazzie saw it all. He saw Cully's menacing posture, Abigail's desperate flight. His eyes, already hard, narrowed to slits of obsidian. He had recognized the almost faded brand on the flank of one of Cully's horses when it had been tethered carelessly outside the saloon the day before, a coiled rattlesnake with a distinctive, forked tongue. It was a mark seared into his memory, a symbol of profound loss, and a catalyst for a vow made long ago. It was the mark of Marcus Grinner Vance. The time for silent observation was over. The storm he had sensed was no longer gathering. It was about to break with the fury of a desert squall. The arrival of Marcus Grinner, Vance himself, a few days later, was like the descent of a vulture king upon an already dying animal. He rode into Whisperwind Gulch, flanked by two more hard-faced men, his presence radiating an aura of absolute, remorseless authority. His grin, the source of his moniker, was a terrifying fixture on his face, a permanent, lipless sneer that seemed to mock the very notion of human compassion. It stretched the puckered, ancient scars around his mouth, making him look like a death's head. He did not bother with inquiries. He strode directly into Martha's general store, his spurs gouging the floorboards, his eyes, pale and cold as frozen river water, immediately finding Abigail. She was standing behind the counter, a roll of gingham clutched in her hands, her face a mask of utter, soul-deep terror. Vance let out a low, guttural sound, a travesty of a chuckle. He said, so it was true. The little mouse had scurried to this particular hole. Martha, her face flushed with outrage, stepped forward, telling him this was a respectable place, and he'd not cause trouble. Vance, without a word, without even a glance, backhanded her. The older woman cried out, stumbling against a display of tinned peaches, which crashed to the floor. Vance snarled at her to stay out of it. This was none of her business. Abigail made a choked, desperate sound, a trapped animal's cry, and tried to bolt for the storeroom. But Cully, who had followed Vance in, blocked her path, his own cruel grin mirroring his master's. She was cornered, her last vestiges of hope evaporating like morning mist under a desert sun. Vance advanced on her, his grin widening. He told her she couldn't run, couldn't hide from what she owed him. He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh like talons. Abigail cried out, a thin, reedy sound of pain and despair. He began to drag her towards the door, towards the street, towards a fate she had spent years fleeing. The town seemed to hold its breath. Faces watched from behind curtains, from the shadowed depths of doorways. Fear a suffocating blanket over Whisperwind Gulch. Sheriff Brody appeared, his hand near his gun, his voice tight as he told Vance to let her go, that disputes were settled by law here. Vance laughed a harsh, grating sound. Law? He was the law where she was concerned. He declared he was taking what was his. Just as he reached the doorway, an arrow, appearing as if from nowhere, thudded into the doorframe, mere inches from Vance's head. It quivered there, a silent, deadly ultimatum. A stunned, absolute silence fell. At the far end of the street, framed by the unforgiving sun, stood Hasteen Yazzie. His bow was still half raised, his expression as impassive as the ancient rock formations that surrounded the town. Yet, an almost visible aura of lethal intent radiated from him. He said, his voice low, but carrying with chilling clarity, that she was not Vance's to take. Vance, recovering from his shock, his face contorting with rage, spat that a brave Injun wanted her, did he? He could have her when they were done. He gestured to his men, who were already fumbling for their weapons. But then, as if summoned from the very dust of the earth, other Navajo warriors materialized. They emerged from alleyways, from the roofs of the low buildings, silent, painted for battle, their expressions grim and unyielding. Vance's men, suddenly finding themselves outnumbered, hesitated, their bravado visibly faltering. Before Vance could react, Hasteen loosed another arrow. It struck Cully's drawing hand, making him scream and drop his pistol. In that instant of distraction, Hasteen moved with the speed of a striking cougar. He reached Abigail, pulled her from Vance's loosened grasp, and commanded her to hold tight. He swung her onto his waiting paint pony and vaulted up behind her. With a wild cry, they were gone, thundering out of town, covered by a volley of arrows from Hasteen's warriors that kicked up dust and discouraged pursuit. Vance, roaring in impotent fury, fired his revolver after them, his bullets whining harmlessly into the empty air. He screamed that Yazzie couldn't hide her, that he knew who he was, that he'd hunt them both down and flay them alive. Miles away, in a hidden arroyo, when they finally stopped, Abigail slid from the horse, trembling. She asked Hasteen why. Why had he done this? He didn't even know her. Hasteen turned, his dark eyes burning with a cold fire. He told her that Marcus Vance and his kind were a poison on the land. Long ago, men like him, under his command, had attacked his wife's winter camp. They had taken his younger sister. He had hunted them ever since. He told Abigail he had seen the mark of their cruelty on her spirit from the moment she arrived, recognized the shadows in her eyes. His vengeance against Vance was long overdue. Her tormentors were his enemies. Their trail of suffering, he vowed, would end here. Abigail listened, stunned. Her solitary, desperate escape had suddenly transformed. It was no longer just an escape. It had become a hunt. A spark of her old, buried resilience, fanned by a new, cold rage, began to glow. She started to speak, telling Hasteen everything she knew about Vance, his men, their habits, their weaknesses, details gathered during years of terror, now repurposed as weapons. Hasteen laid out his plan. They would not run. They would use his knowledge of the land, his warriors, and Abigail's intelligence to turn the tables. They became the hunters. The first strike was against two of Vance's most brutal scouts. Lured into a box canyon by Hasteen, following information from Abigail about their patrol routes, they were met with a deadly volley of arrows. One fell instantly. The other, attempting to flee, was trapped by a rockslide Abigail triggered from above. Justice was swift. One by one, Vance's men were picked off. Cully, overconfident and careless, was captured at a watering hole. Abigail confronted him, no longer the terrified woman from the alley, but a figure of cold resolve. She asked if he remembered her, the one he was looking for. His horrified recognition was his last coherent thought before Hasteen's warriors took him away for their own justice. The final confrontation took place in an abandoned silver mine, a place Vance had once used for his own dark dealings. He was down to his last two men, cornered, desperate. The fight in the suffocating darkness of the tunnels was brutal. Hasteen, though wounded by a lucky shot, fought like a demon. Abigail, seeing Hasteen falter, seized a heavy mining pick. When one of Vance's men charged the injured Navajo, she swung the pick with all the fury of her tormented past, felling the brute. Vance, his grin a rictus of hate, turned on Abigail, roaring that he should have killed her slowly. He lunged, but Hasteen, rallying, tackled him. They crashed to the ground, a savage, desperate struggle. Finally, Hasteen stood over the broken, bleeding Vance. He spoke then, his voice low, of his wife's people, his sister, all the innocents Vance had destroyed. Then, looking at Abigail, her face streaked with dirt and tears, but her eyes blazing, he added that this, too, was for her peace. Vance's reign of terror ended there, in the dust and darkness of the mine. When Hasteen and Abigail emerged from the canyons, Whisperwind Gulch was a town subdued but stirring with a hesitant hope. Sheriff Brody met them, his relief profound. The remaining townsfolk, learning of Vance's complete demise, offered food, water, and a quiet, awed respect. Abigail stood straighter now. The haunted look in her eyes lessened, replaced by a new, hard-won strength. She thanked Hasteen, her words simple but carrying the weight of a life reclaimed. He told her she was free now, the debt paid. He advised her to live well. As he prepared to leave, she asked if he would be safe. A rare smile touched his lips as he replied that the desert was his home. It always provided. He then asked what she would do. Abigail looked at Whisperwind Gulch, no longer just a hiding place, but a place of reckoning, of unexpected alliance. She thought, she said, a small, true smile finally gracing her lips, that she might stay a while, perhaps plant a garden, see if anything could grow here. She had sought anonymity, but found liberation. The West was still wild, still dangerous, but for Abigail, it now held the fragile, precious promise of peace. Hasteen Yazzie rode away, a legend disappearing into the vast land that was his. Abigail watched him go, then turned towards a town, towards a future she would now meet on her own terms, under a sky that suddenly seemed vast with possibility.